Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host, Jacob Berman. Today I'm joined by Jonathan Sheffield. I have his YouTube channel tagged in the description. You can click on it. I recommend you go there and subscribe. And today, Jonathan joins me to talk about the Augustinian hypothesis, or Matthew, or Matthean priority, the priority of the Gospel of Matthew. In early Christianity, and still is largely regarded today in Christian theological circles, that the Gospel of Matthew is actually the first gospel, which is contrary to what the modern consensus scholarship claims, in which they say that Mark is actually the first gospel. And they do use a particular source, which I'm going to get into here soon. I prepared a little PowerPoint to illustrate that, and I'll use that in a few minutes. That being said, Jonathan, why do you think Matthew is the first gospel? And why do you think that Mark being the first gospel is incorrect?
Well, I think it's important to understand is, in coming to that particular conclusion, what gets me there. And I think it's important, when I formulate my views, what foundation am I basing this on? And so any question I get into, I need to evaluate what documentation do I have from the churches themselves, since they're the ones where these documents are found. If we look at the churches, what is the basis for the publication? Because we're dealing with a text that is common to all the churches. And how do I go about understanding how these documents were published and distributed throughout the independent Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches? And so my basis begins with the foundation on the external data. While I do agree that there is value in the linguistics analysis of text to help understand the publication and distribution of these works, I need to get statements or testimony that gives me information on how these texts came to be and how they circulated in the ancient church. So starting with that as a basis, or what is the empirical observation we make, we get to compile a number of ancient statements that speak specifically to this issue. And what we come to find is that the history is common, whether it's from the Church of Alexandria, the Church of Rome, the churches of North Africa, the churches in Asia Minor, is you have a common history from those that were presiding over the government of the churches, that the publication of Matthew came first, that the churches in Judea, Jerusalem were first set up. And as it's made its way, there was a need for documents of that kind to be published for the churches. So it really begins on the principle that we find in courts of law. We start off with the independent sources. So when I look at men with competent knowledge of the events, those that are presiding over the churches, and we compare them, we can see that they all come to this basic conclusion, whether that be Augustine, whether that's Jerome, whether that's Irenaeus, whether that's Origen. And I'm having different governors over the church that come up with a common history. And how best do I explain those facts that they all identify with it? And if they were all lying, what would have been their motivation to falsify such a inconsequence statement such as Mark was first? I believe Rome would have every intention to have such a wonderful thing such as Mark is publishing the word to the people of Rome first. I think that's something that they would cherish. So for me, it really begins with the foundation, a foundation that Arian used in the composition of building his histories on Alexandria. We're following a methodological process that shows that our courts use, that ancient historians use, such as Arian, to come to an understanding of the history of the text in the churches.
Yeah, when I was looking into this, a long time ago, I noticed that the similar things, that the same things really, that there seems to be a vast tradition of text that talk about the order of the four Gospels, and they do indeed say that Matthew is first. And that leads me to bring up this presentation. I just gotta. Uh, Let me just get up here on the software. There we are. So what I have on the screen here is Papias, fragment 6. Papias, who is used by scholarship to actually vindicate the idea that Mark is the first gospel, because Papias appears to say that, or insinuate that Mark is first, or at least that's what scholars claim that this passage is actually suggesting, and that Matthew is second, because he says that Mark put his text together from looking at Peter, and then Matthew put the oracle together. He puts it in the following sentence, and then that's it. He doesn't mention any other gospel. What do you think about that claim? Have you heard of that before? That the claim that Papias is vindicating Mark is first?
Well, when we look at his statement first, we're getting this information through Eusebius, so we're only getting a part of some of the writings from Eusebius, which is important because Eusebius, who is our church historian, not only looked at the writings of Papias, but he went to Irenaeus, Tertullian. He had a number of sources that he compiled. I kind of compare him to the equivalent of Arian. So what Arian was to the Athenians, that kind of court historian under Hadrian, Eusebius was for us. Now, it's interesting that while maybe some modern scholars may take that position, Eusebius, who had access to his documents, doesn't draw that conclusion that Papias is making that insinuation. And he actually quotes, Clement and Origen and Irenaeus in building his history for the publication of the gospel. So any insinuation there. Now, what Papias does provide is actually our first lead in the case for identifying that the disciples of Jesus brought their works into public notice, in the sense that he identified Matthew and Mark as bringing their gospel publications into public notice for other people to recognize and know. So while I've heard that, I think in passing a couple of times, Eusebius, who is the historian compiling this data that we have from Papias, doesn't draw that conclusion at all. And so it's interesting in his history, even though he quotes on the order of the Gospels, he doesn't draw that inference from Papias' statements on there.
Yeah, I've noticed that, and it's like when I look at the other texts that you mentioned, like texts like from Jerome and
like Augustine,
yeah,
we talk Origen, they definitively state in their language that Matthew was first. They give us details such as it was published in Judea at the Church of Jerusalem, you know, and I think it's important to understand with that is how does Christianity come into being throughout the empire? And when we look at its origins, that's where Christianity began. Even Tacitus was able to understand that, you know, the origin of Christianity began in Judea, and it later spread throughout the empire, eventually coming to Rome and spreading throughout Asia Minor. So we see very early on with the Church of Jerusalem, the Church of Antioch, to help, I guess, kind of propagate, you know, the Christian faith. They were already setting up churches. There was obviously a need to supply those churches with whether you call it propaganda or their publication or their narrative, to help establish the foundation to create what we see in Christianity today. It's spread all over. So how do you do that except with the propagation of your material? And in the same way that the Homeric epics were distributed throughout Athenian society, we see the same thing with Christianity beginning in Judea. And we have a number of prominent churches such as Antioch in Syria, Jerusalem, Galilee, that are taking shape and beginning. How are those churches operating without any physical gospel that they were preaching? So I think it's a matter of understanding the origins of Christianity. There was a need for a publication when you're setting up all these churches, and then we have the statements from a number of respectable fathers overseeing the government of the church that would obviously have competent and relevant knowledge of the events that associated with these churches that go back to the very beginning.
I have a question from a super chat. Dharma Defender, thank you for the $5 super chat. His question for you, Jonathan, is: do you believe that the Gospel of Matthew that we have is first, or a different Gospel of Matthew? How could it be ours when it copies Mark verbatim?
Well, and so here's the thing: is there's two ways to look at it. And I know you kind of brought up at the beginning about the Augustinian hypothesis. So it's interesting that Augustine does a literary analysis, or his literary analysis, and he comes to the opposite conclusion, looking at the same data that we are looking at today. He believes Mark was following Matthew. And so if we understand, the history of Christianity in the sense that it began in Judea, there were churches that came into being, the Church of Jerusalem. We look at Antioch, where the disciples were first called Christians. And we look at that and we say, okay, well, they have these churches that are coming up all over the area of Judea and into Syria. And what we see is now the preaching, the ministry of the word, and that has been going on for quite a while. And the documentation that we have doesn't bring Christianity to Rome to probably around 42 or 44 AD. If we equate Suetonius's statement with the arrival of Christianity in Rome, and if we take some of the statements from the fathers, Hippolytus, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, where Simon Magus had come on scene, he was trying to control his own narrative, and then Peter comes on scene to kind of dispel what he's saying and start setting up the church in Rome. Obviously, anything that's going to come to Rome would naturally bring the Gospel of Matthew with them, because we already see in the documentation that it was being shipped off all the way to India. So with the arrival of Christianity in Rome, what would have already been out there in circulation and publication is Matthew. Now, Peter, who the documentation is telling us he was preaching at Rome. Mark is taking note of his sermons to publish into a publication for the churches that he was asked to do. Peter was somebody that was with Matthew during this entire during his career. So during this ministry that supposedly happened, he was there. So what would we expect to see from two witnesses that were on scene together during this ministry? Peter was at Jerusalem. So any of the works that would have been published there and was publicly being preached at the churches at Antioch, Jerusalem, that he was been there, he would have had knowledge of. In addition to, he was another witness that was there supposedly during this ministry of Jesus. So we would expect in most cases that testimony, we would see the same testimony between witnesses that were on scene together. And that's what we see. Now, whether they, who's following who, if we're only able to look at a linguistic analysis, well, we have different views coming out of this school of thought of linguistics. Augustine and Chrysostom looked at that text, they all had them, and did not come to that conclusion. And we do have to explain why after 1786, with the first formal publication of this idea and the documentary hypothesis that doesn't come out until about 1838 by Wiseman, that we come up with that formulation. Remember, Griesbach in 1783 did not come to that conclusion, even though he started taking on a different interpretation of the text. He still had Matthew first. So why didn't he see what Wiseman did? And if you think about it, out of this linguistic analysis, we have 7 competing theories between the Jerusalem hypothesis, the 2-source hypothesis, Streeter's 4-source hypothesis. We have a Goodacre's Farron hypothesis. So looking at this data linguistically, we come up with 7 competing theories that don't support each other. And is it because we are moving away from the empirical foundation as our basis?
So with Matthew being the first gospel in your view, how do you look at the 2-source hypothesis from that angle? Because there are people out there that say Matthew is first, but they still believe in this, and they have in the hypothetical Q document, and they think that Matthew borrowed from that earlier text.
Well, I think one of the things about the Q document is when we look at the churches or the empirical documentation, there's lots of documentation that comes down from the various churches. And we're talking about Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, all these epicenters of Christianity. Now, there is no artifact identified from any of these sources of a Q source. While I do understand how they can possibly draw an inference between what Papias may say in terms of maybe the sayings of the Lord or what they refer to them, or even what Justin comes out about the oracles of the Lord. We don't find any such Q document as an artifact. And you would think we have Matthew, we have Mark, we have Luke, we have John, we have a number of the Gnostic publications that have come down. We have all these traditions that have come down, but in the publication of these documents, when we get definitive statements from Irenaeus, Tertullian, Augustine, Jerome, the historians of the church, there is no mention of this sayings, and there's no artifact to support that has come down. So once again, to kind of support that hypothesis, it has no artifact, or it has no definitive statement from the ancient world to that effect. So we're operating more possibly in speculation than in actual testimony. Whether the testimony is good or bad, we don't even have that. And that's why it makes it very difficult to support that statement against all the statements of the fathers on this.
Going back to Papias, scholars actually use Papias as well, not just to apparently vindicate Mark as being the first gospel, but also to vindicate the Q documents. Not no longer being a hypothetical document, but actually that it actually existed. And they also use the Gospel of Thomas in tandem with that. They say that the Gospel of Thomas was copying from the Q document because the Gospel of Thomas appears to confirm their prediction of what the Q document would have looked like, but it has Gnostic elements in it, so it can't be the Q document. Although I think there's a scholar or two, not many, that actually take a leap further and they claim that is actually the Q document. But typically, they say Papias mentions it by saying, "Oh, Matthew borrowed from these sayings, the logoi."
Yeah, and once again, if we had confirmation from a Eusebius or Irenaeus, now there's a lot we can corroborate with Papias in terms of when we look at his statement and Clement's statement, on how Mark came to be. First, there's no mention of a Q source there. He says that Mark compiled these statements from Peter's sermons, that they were authorized to be read in the churches. There's no other history because he speaks at length about Peter in Rome, his preaching ministry, and what Mark was, how Mark was able to build the Gospel of Peter, and then issue that document to the churches. There's no reference to any other separate document. Now, the sayings of the oracles we see in the Didache, what we see in there refers to as the Gospel of the Lord. I know Justin Martyr talks about the memoirs. So while they may be referencing, when we go and look at the physical churches, we only see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't see any of this. We don't see a Q document. The Jesus Seminar was the one that said the Gospel of Thomas was Q. But this idea of a Q document is a hypothesis in the sense that we have no artifact to support it. So there's no copy of it. There's no actual manuscript that speaks to this, and there's no testimony coming out from the government of the churches. So in terms of, can we look at a statement of Papias, but can we corroborate that with another independent source that states the same thing? So in light of that, we have to look at what we find in the churches, not an inference of what we're trying to draw from Papias that Eusebius obviously does not draw that conclusion.
And scholars, they go on to talk about additional hypothetical documents, like the Streeter hypothesis is a huge web of hypothetical documents. Like I was just showing it on the screen as you were talking for a moment there. Um, he's talking about the M source, the
The Q
L
and the L.
source, and the Antiochian document, which I never really understood where he was going there with the whole Antiochian document business. He's got the document of infancy, Proto Luke, and the other thing is there are several, like there's a different hypothetical. There are different hypothetical documents of Mark, Mark, Proto Mark, and then we finally get to Mark, our copy of Mark. Anyway, what do you think about all these long line of hypothetical document claims?
In my debate with Dr. Goodacre, I wanted to show the correlation between the emergence of all these theories with the break in the empirical epistemology. So, and one of the things that I tried to do is really show this correlation between the kind of worldview that came into being at the time of Kant with in the academy. And obviously, I went through some information from Stephen Hicks that shows that with Kant we see the first break in the empirical epistemology for the speculative philosophies that started giving rise. And what we saw that cultivated, from that time period down through the next 200 years is the formulation of all these hypotheses that felt like they had to explain the Christian text in a sort of evolutionary way. And then what happens is when you get off the empirical foundation, for the speculative philosophies, it starts drawing you into all these alternative hypotheses that you have to create when you're trying to satisfy all the facts. And what has happened in this field, and one of the points I was bringing up is that while there's this consensus view, there's a caveat to that. There's a lot of studies in their statements that show, well, yeah, this is the default view. We really don't have a lot of confidence in it because there's not a lot of logical weight to these theories. And what I presented in that debate was a number of statements from the literature themselves in the academy, from their so-called consensus that says, well, we really don't even believe this because there's not a lot of weight to any of these theories. Because we're dealing with a lot of unknown documents that cannot be corroborated, and we keep going down these different rabbit holes to explain how these gospels came to be. If we don't accept what the churches, those that were presiding over these churches, said, and this is where we look at the byproduct of this linguistic approach is, we have 7 or 8 competing hypotheses that don't even agree with themselves. So what value can we glean except that there's a methodological problem that's going on? And it all really began at a time when we broke with the empirical tradition. And then we relied on more subjective means to investigate the text. Which leads me to believe if Arian took this approach on the history of Alexander, what type of history would we have had? He was aware of all these traditions of Alexandria, and that's why he chose to compose his history on primary two ancient witnesses that had relevant and knowledgeable events. And what's missing from their hypothesis in each of these is they have no foundation like a Ptolemy or an Aristobulus for their foundation. So they're working off a speculative philosophy to build off of. So there's nothing firm there. So what we get in each of these hypotheses is something different, which has led the academy to say, well, yeah, this is our default position, but we really don't have a lot of faith or confidence in these views because they could be argued in either way, which leads to a position, why aren't we going back to what the church has said they did?
It makes me curious, if they don't have much confidence in their position, why even bother holding those views? It's peculiar.
Yeah, John Wentham was one of the professors of Dr. Goodacre. We kind of discussed that a little bit, but the thing is, they've done all this research, they invested so much in this hypothesis, but they're unwilling to, abandon their conclusion. And if you think about it, there's been so much literature out on this that, they made such an investment on this, that how do you turn back from all that? They kind of, and I know Wentham puts it, they've kind of been content to just go along with the authority and just accept it as a working hypothesis, even though they know it doesn't have any logical weight. Which, brings me to a point is this the byproduct of getting off an empirical standard, that you're kind of trapped into this view? And, we have this big movement into postmodernism where facts don't matter. What's the benefit of resorting back to what the church has actually said? I think I even quoted a sort of modern footnote towards the end of my debate that makes in Eusebius's history, there's a modern footnote that says, in spite of the evidence of Clement, Origen, and Eusebius himself, most scholars regard Mark's gospel as the first, which when you think about that, so you're being presented with all these evidence and it's like, all right, well, facts don't matter. I'm still going to hold to my conclusion despite the data. And that lends me to believe, are we really following the facts in this case, or are we stuck to maintaining the narrative?
Scholars also, as you know, claim that the four Gospels they're really forgeries. Matthew didn't write Matthew, Mark didn't write Mark, Luke didn't write Luke, and John didn't write John. And the funny thing about that is Papias, who they put on a huge pedestal because he appears to say that Mark is first, in their opinion. They reject Papias anyway because he says something that they don't like. Because he says, well, actually, Mark did write Mark and Matthew did write Matthew. But when he says that, that's not okay. What do you think about that?
Well, it's sort of picking and choosing your history to kind of fit your particular worldview. And while I don't say we have to accept every particular statement from Papias, Irenaeus, or what does the collective evidence say? So when we look at the weight of the evidence, can it be collaborated between independent witnesses? So it's where two or more witnesses agree, this is a standard that we follow. And this is where it appears that they're spending more time, because the question we have to deal with is we have unnamed documents, and I think we all can agree that they don't have their title named to them, but you have all the churches of the apostles coming up with these same names. And these are churches that historically haven't agreed with each other. They were fighting over when the date of Easter should first be observed between Asia Minor and Rome very early on, but they all come up with the same testimony. And when we take that standard to a normal court of law, that would be conclusive. But in modern academia, it seems like there's a different standard that's being applied. So we're looking for where things can be, where they agree. And this is a point of fact that they agree on these particular facts. Lots of stuff that they disagree with. There's lots of books that they disagree with. 2 Peter, Revelation, James, 2nd and 3rd John. So they had their feel for disputes in the church on a number of books, a number of scriptures. But this is where they all agree. And with that, they would be conclusive. So I think it shows a worldview that we want to stick with our narrative instead of following the facts.
So that being said, I want to go back to what I was saying a moment ago. They claim that the four Gospels are forgeries. We're told when we're told that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. And they base it on the manuscript evidence that the early manuscripts apparently weren't titled. And that's something I didn't cover in my previous question, that the early manuscripts weren't titled, but the later manuscripts were titled according to them. What do you think about that part of the argument?
Well, if we're going to allege that it was forged, well, who forged it? It obviously had to be someone that was well acquainted with churches, because we have to look at a physical mechanism to get a forged document in a number of churches. Tertullian talks about, a presbyter, someone that was involved in the Church of Ephesus that tried to put together a document of Paul. Now, while he had sort of his own good reasons for doing it, he was spotted by the congregation. He was deposed from his presbyterhood, and he was expelled from the church. The Bishop of Antioch, Serapin, talks about the Gospel of Peter, not Mark, but the Gospel of Peter, and showing that we are men of experience. We know that this document was not handed down. And I think what gets missed in this conversation is we have all these independent churches. They were set up with bishops to oversee the government of the church. And what we can see is that they can establish a legal chain of custody back to the apostles in these churches. So they were able to secure the transfer and control of these documents. And so when we're talking about a firewall, there were pieces put in place to prevent this type of activity. Now, can you get it in one church? Possibly. There are documents that showed up in churches, but how do you get them in all? So someone, and remember, the church until the Edict of Milan was underground. They didn't have legal status in the ancient world in the Roman Empire. So you would have had to have a very innate knowledge to get in there. They just didn't bring in outsiders. And you had to be part of the group to authorize these readings, these documents in the church. So how do you do that as an outsider? And the question about a forger is, we know of a number of forged documents in the ancient world, and they don't show up in these churches. They were well aware of this, but we can't have an imaginary forger. We're talking about a document that's in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, all over Asia Minor. That would take a huge coordinated effort. So if you can't name who the forger was, and we can document a number of forgers in the ancient world that tried to produce gospel publications. I mean, it was Marcion. He produced his version of Luke and 10 letters of Paul. but none of those documents got their way into the church. And he was part of a big movement. So how would Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John get into this group? There was no central leadership over the church. You have to document that allegation. It can't just be asserted.
Yeah, because it's like at first it doesn't start out as a forgery. That it's just not attributed to anybody. It's anonymous, and then later copies put names in there. So later copies turn them into forgeries in that sense, from their argument anyway. What do you think about the dating of the Gospels? They claim that the four Gospels has to come after AD 70, after the Jewish War, after AD 73, when the war's over. What do you think about that scenario?
Well, when you look at it, so it goes back to mechanism. So if you think about after 70 AD, who was alive then? Possibly John, with Paul being out of the picture, Peter being out of the picture, Matthew, or any of those primarily associated or the main leadership or group at that time. Most of them had passed away. Let's say for a given, John, survives well after into the period of Trajan, Domitian. Let's say he survives to that. Now, you need an orchestrated effort to distribute these four Gospels. I mean, someone has to write them. And then you're talking about all these churches are being set up and organized all over the Roman Empire. And so they're having service with no scriptures. I mean, Paul is writing to these churches indicating that they had scriptures or they had received the gospel. Who could have done it after 70 AD? It can't be an imaginary person. And I kind of equate it to Pisistratus. Pisistratus was able to orchestrate the composition of the Homeric text at Athens in the 6th century BC. He brought in a lot of people. He was able to orchestrate the compilation of the text, and then he was able to distribute it through Athenian society. You would need a central figure of that authority that had command over all the churches to do that. And he would have to bring in a team of that. And the fact that they have no known person, it can't be imaginary people, it can't be unknown people. We know how works circulate in the ancient world, and we're talking about a well-documented time. So this work is being circulated and no one knew who they were getting these documents from, and it would take a huge effort. So after 70 AD, you don't have a mechanism or the people that were there to authorize such a transaction in all the churches. We didn't have an Emperor Constantine until the 4th century. We didn't have an Uthman like with the Quran. You have to have a mechanism like Pisistratus for the Homeric text to initiate a common text throughout the church societies. That's why not only all the external documentation points to them, we don't have any other suspects besides these apostles. So, oh, bless you. So that's where we run into a problem. They don't have anyone after 70 AD who could have done it. So you have no mechanism to accomplish the writing of the four documents. And if it's a group of people, why didn't they align the genealogies in Matthew and Luke together? Were they four separate people? How did they get through the firewall of the churches? And what was the churches doing for the 40 past years with no scriptures in there?
So to sum up this live stream, what you're basically saying is there's like a huge mountain of evidence against the consensus view that Mark is the first gospel, and you have all these early church texts that are basically saying the same thing, that Matthew is first. How could they all be wrong? And how could the theory that Mark is first be right when there's practically nobody in the ancient world that said that Mark is first? There was not a disagreement in the early church about the order of the Gospels, and in doing so, by making Mark first, a bunch of hypothetical documents were created to explain this scenario. Hypothetical documents, which you argue don't have good evidence for their existence either, which relies on the idea that Mark is first in the first place, so it relies on that presupposition when it has no testimony from the ancient world supporting it.
Yeah, I think that's what it boils down to. They have more faith in documents that we have no knowledge of. We have to look at, three major things. First, how do we compose and build a reliable empirical history? Appealing to Arian is a very functional model that produce an excellent history. And when we apply those same principles to this question, and we look at the available data that has come down to us, this is an area, and while they debated a number of issues in the church, this is one they all came to agreement on. There was no dispute on this particular issue. And we get that same view, and we can explain the history of this view, a view that comes up with the break in the empirical epistemology. We see that break in the German schools that spread throughout England. And what cultivated in there was all these various views from Griesbach to Wiseman to Streeter, that has ballooned into competing hypotheses to explain the history of the text. And we have 7, 8, 9 different views that rely on all these hypothetical documents, and they're ignoring the external data, which gives a very consistent answer to this particular question. What it boils down to, and Dr. Goodacre was pretty honest about it, is they can only make internal arguments for their case. They have no external data to support that. Based on that alone, that wouldn't hold up in any court of law. You got to have at least 2 independent sources to support your material facts, and they have none. Whereas on our end, we have thousands. So why ignore the independent testimony that is conclusive on this issue? For the speculative views that have created 7, 8, 9 different positions that they themselves say we don't really have a lot of confidence in.
Well, all right then. Jonathan Sheffield, thank you for joining me. I would like to have you back on again at some point down the line. I really enjoyed this discussion. I want to thank all the participants earlier that asked questions. I want to thank Dharma Defender again for the super chat. Liren, thank you for your super chat. He just donated 15 shekels. I'm going to read Liren's statement, and then we'll head off. He says, I agree with Sheffield over indulging in abstraction without reference to the external world is wrong. His epistemology is right.
Oh, thank you. Right about something, finally.
All right, then. I want to thank everybody for watching. Check out Jonathan Sheffield's channel. His link is in the description. Subscribe over there. And if you're not subscribed to mine, please do so as well. Like, share this video, get it out there. And I thank everybody for watching.
Thank you.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.